The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the quiet suburban street. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, as if holding on could keep me from spiraling into thoughts I wasn't ready to face. It had been one of those days, long, exhausting, and tinged with the kind of loneliness that felt heavier than usual. Work had drained me, not just physically, but emotionally. The office was a place where I wore masks I didn't even realize I owned anymore, smiling when expected, nodding at jokes that didn't land, all while feeling like an imposter in my own life. Driving home should have been a reprieve, but instead, it only amplified the weight pressing down on my chest. My mind wandered to things I tried so hard to bury during daylight hours, the dreams I'd given up on, the relationships I'd let slip through my fingers, the person I used to be before fear and doubt took root. And then there were the questions I couldn't silence no matter how hard I tried. Who am I really? What do I want? Do I deserve happiness? Or is this hollow ache just part of who I'll always be? As I turned onto Maple Street, lost in thought, blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. My heart sank. Of course, because why wouldn't today end like this? I pulled over slowly, cursing under my breath as adrenaline surged through me. The cop approached my window, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. When he leaned down, resting one hand on the roof of my car, our eyes met for the first time, and something shifted inside me. He wasn't what I expected. Not some stoic authority figure barking orders, but someone different. His voice carried a calm authority, sure, but there was warmth beneath it, a hint of curiosity that made me look twice. He asked for my license and registration, his gaze steady yet searching, as though he saw more than just another driver making a careless mistake. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, the faintest trace of stubble along his jawline catching the last rays of sunlight. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Mind stepping out of the vehicle, he said finally, breaking the spell. His tone was polite, almost gentle, but firm enough to remind me of the situation. I nodded, fumbling with the door handle, my pulse quickening for reasons I couldn't quite explain. As I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed charged, electric, as if the universe itself had conspired to throw us together in this strange, intimate moment. And then came the search, a routine procedure, he explained, his touch clinical but not unkind. But every brush of his fingers against my skin sent a jolt coursing through me, igniting something forbidden, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Each movement was measured, professional, yet undeniably personal. My throat tightened as I realized where his hand lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, an accidental graze along my lower back that felt anything but accidental. I wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of indifference, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood frozen, hyper-aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and cologne clinging to him, the way his presence filled the space around me until it felt like there was nothing else in the world. By the time he finished, my mind was racing, torn between guilt and desire, confusion and longing. He handed me back my documents, his expression unreadable, and told me to drive safely. But as I slid back into the driver's seat, watching him walk away, I knew one thing for certain. This encounter wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Dinner was half-eaten leftovers reheated in silence, the TV droning in the background as I stared blankly at the wall. I kept replaying the traffic stop in my head, dissecting every detail, every nuance of his demeanor. Why did he seem so familiar, so achingly real, when most people faded into the background of my daily grind? Was it his confidence, the quiet assurance in his movements? Or was it something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name? Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again. The curve of his lips as he spoke, the intensity in his gaze, the way his touch lingered like a phantom. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. Like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. And yet, the forbidden nature of it gnawed at me. A cop of all people, someone whose job was to uphold rules, boundaries, order. How could I reconcile the chaos brewing inside me with the image of him standing there, calm and composed, as if he held all the answers? By morning, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones, but the memory of him remained vivid, refusing to fade. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment blown out of proportion by my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, however subtly, and there was no going back. Whatever this was, this inexplicable pull, it had already taken hold, weaving its way into the fabric of my days and nights. And I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths were destined to cross again. The next day, I found myself driving the same route home, almost as if my subconscious was daring fate to intervene again. It wasn't rational. Why would he be there? The world wasn't that small, and life didn't work like a movie. But still, I couldn't help glancing at the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting those blue lights to flash once more. They didn't. Instead, I spotted him standing on the sidewalk near the corner store, leaning casually against his patrol car. His arms were crossed, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man who knew exactly how much space he took up in any given moment. For a split second, I considered speeding past, pretending not to notice him. But something stopped me, a mix of curiosity and recklessness I hadn't felt in years. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands trembling slightly on the wheel. What was I doing? This wasn't me. I wasn't someone who chased after cops, or anyone really. Yet here I was, killing the engine and stepping out of the car before I could talk myself out of it, that he noticed me immediately, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said, his voice smooth but edged with amusement. There was no judgment in his tone, just a quiet confidence that somehow put me at ease and unsettled me all at once. Words failed me. Brilliant. Here I was, face to face with the man who'd been haunting my thoughts for 24 hours, and all I could manage was stammering like a teenager. I cleared my throat, trying again. "I just wanted to say thanks. For yesterday, you were fair." His lips quirked into a faint smile, one corner lifting higher than the other. Fair's part of the job description. He pushed off the car and took a step closer, closing some of the distance between us. "But you don't strike me as someone who goes out of their way to thank people." "No," I asked, tilting my head slightly. My pulse quickened as he moved nearer, his presence overwhelming in the best possible way. "What do I strike you as?" He studied me for a moment, his eyes scanning my face like he was searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "Someone who thinks too much," he said finally. "Someone who carries the weight of the world on their shoulders and doesn't know how to let anyone else help." The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. I looked away, suddenly self-conscious under his scrutiny. "Maybe," I muttered, shoving my hands into my pockets. "Or maybe I'm just cautious." "Cautious is good," he replied, taking another step closer until we were only a few feet apart. "But sometimes caution keeps you from taking chances worth taking." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. Was he talking about me pulling over to talk to him right now? Or was this something deeper, something neither of us was ready to acknowledge yet? I didn't know, and the uncertainty thrilled and terrified me in equal measure that we stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching taut, but not uncomfortable. Finally, he broke it. "You hungry? There's a diner around the block. Best pie in town." It was such an ordinary question, so disarmingly normal, that it caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to say no, to retreat back into the safety of my predictable, lonely routine. But another part, the reckless part that had driven me here in the first place, nodded before I could think better of it. "Sure," I said, forcing a casual shrug. "Why not?" The diner was cozy, its vinyl booths worn but clean, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fried food. We slid into a booth by the window, the late afternoon light casting golden streaks across the table. For the first time since meeting him, I felt a flicker of unease. In the daylight, without the adrenaline-fueled tension of a traffic stop, this felt dangerously real. Too real, so he began, picking up the menu but not really looking at it. "What's your story?" "My story," I echoed, fiddling with the edge of the laminated menu. Not much to tell. Just living life, I guess. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Everyone's got a story. Some are just harder to crack open than others. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Something about him made me want to share things I'd buried deep inside. Secrets I rarely admitted even to myself. But old habits die hard, and I deflected with humor instead. Well, if you're looking for drama, I'm probably not your guy. Unless you count accidentally burning toast as high-stakes action. He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine, and leaned back in the booth, studying me with that same penetrating gaze. You're good at deflecting. I'll give you that. Occupational hazard. I shot back, surprising myself with the honesty. Years of practice. Practice makes perfect, he agreed, his tone lighter now. But perfection's overrated. Our conversation flowed easily after that, skirting around heavier topics while finding comfort in the mundane. He told me about growing up in a small town, about joining the force because he wanted to make a difference, even if it meant facing skepticism from people who doubted him. I listened intently, fascinated by the glimpses of vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. In turn, I shared bits and pieces of my own life, my job, my hobbies, the things that made me laugh or frustrated me to no end. But there were gaps, silences where unspoken truths lingered just below the surface. I avoided mentioning anything too personal, too raw, and he seemed to sense that, respecting my boundaries while gently nudging me toward opening up. It was maddening and exhilarating all at once, this dance we were doing, neither of us willing to take the first real leap. When the check came, he insisted on paying, brushing off my protest with a wave of his hand. Next time, it's on you, he said with a grin, and the implication that there would be a next time sent a thrill through me as we walked back to our respective cars, the sun dipping lower in the sky. He paused beside mine and turned to face me. Thanks for humoring me, he said softly, his expression serious now. I know I'm not exactly conventional company. Neither am I admitted, meeting his gaze. For a moment, everything else faded away, the noise of the street, the chill in the air, the doubts swirling my mind. All that mattered was the connection between us, fragile but undeniable. Then he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm in a gesture that was both comforting and electric. Take care of yourself, he murmured before stepping back and heading to his car. I watched him drive away, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever this was between us, it was far from simple. There were obstacles aplenty, his profession, my fears, the societal expectations looming over us like storm clouds. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel entirely alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. The days that followed our impromptu diner meeting felt like a strange blend of anticipation and unease. I couldn't stop thinking about him, his voice, his laugh, the way he seemed to see straight through my carefully constructed walls. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. And yet, every time I thought about reaching out, doubt crept in. What did he even want from me? Was this just a fleeting curiosity on his part, or was there something more beneath the surface? Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the message. Hope you're not avoiding me. Thought you might like to grab coffee tomorrow. It was simple, straightforward, and utterly disarming. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before typing out a reply. I'm not avoiding you. Coffee sound good. Relief washed over me when he responded almost instantly. Great. Same place as last time? 7 p.m. I agreed, though my stomach churned with nerves. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not with someone like him. Yet here I was, willingly stepping into territory I'd sworn off long ago. The cafe was warm and inviting, its walls lined with bookshelves and soft jazz playing faintly in the background. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. His face lit up when he saw me, and for a moment, all my doubts melted away. You made it, he said, standing to greet me. His smile was easy, genuine, and it hit me right in the chest. I did. I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. Figured I owed you after the pie. He laughed, the sound low and rich, and gestured toward the barista. Order whatever you want. My treat. I hesitated, but didn't argue, opting for a latte with an extra shot of espresso. When I returned to the table, he was watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. You look tired, he observed gently. Everything okay? His concern caught me off guard. Most people wouldn't have noticed or cared, but he did. That alone was enough to make my defenses waver. Just work stuff? I muttered, stirring sugar into my drink. Nothing exciting. Work stuff, huh? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Care to elaborate? Or is this another one of those things you're going to dodge? I smirked despite myself. You don't give up, do you? Not when it matters, he said simply, his gaze steady. And you matter. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I looked down at my coffee, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. At least, not with such sincerity. It scared me, how much I wanted to believe him that we talked for hours, moving seamlessly from lighthearted banter to deeper topics. He told me about his struggles with balancing duty and personal life, about the loneliness that came with wearing a badge. In turn, I shared fragments of my own story, the pressure to conform, the fear of being seen as less than, the ache of hiding parts of myself, even from those closest to me. At one point, he reached across the table and placed a hand over mine. The contact was brief, but electric, sending a jolt through me that left me breathless. You don't have to carry everything alone, he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. Sometimes letting someone in makes all the difference. His touch lingered in my mind long after we left the cafe, walking side by side under the glow of streetlights. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. We wandered aimlessly, neither of us in a hurry to part ways. So, he said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence, "What's your favorite thing about fall?" I glanced at him, surprised by the randomness of the question. "The colors," I admitted after a moment. "The way the trees look like they're on fire. It's beautiful." He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I get that. There's something magical about change, isn't there? Even if it's temporary." His words resonated deeply, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because I saw parallels in my own life. The seasons shifting, old patterns giving way to new possibilities. Or maybe it was just the way he said it, with such quiet conviction, that made me want to believe in magic again. Later, as we stood outside my apartment building, the world around us hushed and still, he turned to face me. "Thanks for tonight," he said softly. "I had fun." "Me too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us charged with unspoken longing. Then, without warning, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against my cheek. "I meant what I said earlier," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. "You matter, more than you realize." Before I could respond, he pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead and stepped back, leaving me reeling. My heart raced as I watched him walk away, his silhouette fading into the shadows. I touched my fingers to the spot where his lips had been, overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions I couldn't untangle. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm of stolen moments and quiet connection. Sometimes it was coffee or dinner. Other times, it was late-night phone calls where we talked about everything and nothing. Each interaction brought us closer, chipping away at the walls I'd built around myself. But with every step forward, my fears grew louder. One afternoon, while hiking together on a secluded trail, he stopped abruptly and turned to face me. "What's holding you back?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Because I can feel it. Every time we get close, you pull away." I froze, caught off guard by his perceptiveness. "It's complicated," I hedged, looking anywhere but at him. "Complicated how?" he pressed, taking a step closer. "Is it me? Something I've done?" "No," I exclaimed quickly, shaking my head. "It's not you. It's me. I'm not used to this, any of it. Letting someone in, trusting them. It's terrifying." He studied me for a long moment, his expression softening. "I get it. Trust takes time. but running from it won't make it easier. I'm not running. I argued weakly, though we both knew it was a lie. Then stay, he said simply, reaching out to take my hand. Stay, and let me show you it doesn't have to be scary. Not with me. His words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of retreat. For the first time, I let myself imagine a future where I didn't have to hide anymore. A future where I could be fully, unapologetically myself. And maybe, just maybe, he could be part of IT as we continued down the trail, our hands intertwined. I allowed myself to hope. Hope that love could bloom in unexpected places, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that sometimes taking a chance was worth the risk. The rain began as a soft drizzle, barely noticeable at first, but within minutes it had transformed into a steady downpour. We were caught off guard, halfway through our evening walk along the riverfront, and scrambled for cover beneath the awning of a closed cafe. The world around us blurred into streaks of gray and silver, the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement filling the air with a rhythmic patter. I stood close to him, closer than I'd allowed myself before, the warmth of his body radiating against mine despite the chill in the air. Neither of us spoke at first, too focused on catching our breath and shaking off the dampness clinging to our clothes. But when he turned to look at me, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes dark and intense, something shifted between us, something irreversible. You're soaked, he said finally, his voice low and rough-edged, like the storm outside had seeped into his throat. He reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of wet hair from my face. His fingers lingered longer than necessary, tracing the curve of my jaw with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. "So are you," I replied, my voice barely audible over the rain. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, each beat echoing the truth I'd been running from. I wanted him, not just tonight, not just in this fleeting moment, but in a way that terrified me, a way that meant opening myself up completely, letting go of every fear and doubt I'd carried for years. He must have seen something in my expression, a flicker of vulnerability, perhaps because his hand dropped to my shoulder, gripping it firmly but gently. "Talk to me," he urged, his gaze searching mine. "Whatever's going on in that head of yours, let me in." I swallowed thickly, the weight of his words pressing down on me. How could I explain what I barely understood myself? That I was afraid, not of him, but of what loving him might cost me, of how much it would hurt if he ever walked away. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. Whatever this is between us, it's not supposed to happen. People like me don't get happy endings." His brow furrowed, confusion mingling with concern. "People like you? Gay people?" I clarified, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Cops who fall for guys they pull over. It's messy, complicated, impossible. And yet here we are." For a moment, he didn't respond, his silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer until there was no space left between us. His hands framed my face, forcing me to meet his eyes. "You think I don't know that?" he asked, his tone raw with emotion. "You think I haven't spent every second since that traffic stop wondering if this is wrong, if I'm crossing some line I shouldn't? But none of that matters. Not the rules, not the risks, because being near you feels more right than anything else in my life ever has." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring his features even further. I wanted to believe him, desperately. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. "What happens when it doesn't work out?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "When the world decides we're too different, too dangerous for each other?" "We'll deal with it," he said firmly, his thumbs wiping away the tears streaming down my cheeks. "Together, one step at a time. But I can't keep pretending this isn't real, that what I feel for you doesn't matter. Because it does. You do." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both achingly tender and overwhelmingly passionate. It wasn't perfect. Our noses bumped awkwardly, and the rain continued to pour around us. But it was everything. In that moment, all the walls I'd built crumbled, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. I loved him. And maybe, just maybe, he loved me too. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, we were both breathing heavily, the storm outside mirroring the chaos in my heart. "Say something," he murmured, his voice tinged with uncertainty for the first time. I hesitated, struggling to find the words. Finally, I settled on the simplest, most honest thing I could say. "I don't want to run anymore." Relief washed over his face, followed by a smile so radiant it lit up the entire dreary night. "Good," he said, pulling me into his arms. "Because I'm done chasing you. From now on, we face this together." As we stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the rain slowly easing into a gentle mist, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. This wasn't the end of our story, it was only the beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would tackle them side by side, two imperfect souls finding solace in each other's imperfections. And for the first time in my life, I believe in the possibility of a happy ending. The days following that rain-soaked kiss were a blur of heightened emotions, sleepless nights, and stolen glances. Everything felt sharper, more vivid, like the world had been dipped in technicolor after years of black and white monotony. But with the euphoria came an undercurrent of unease, a nagging reminder that happiness this intense rarely came without consequences. Tea first, it was easy to ignore the looming shadows. We spent every possible moment together, navigating our newfound intimacy with a mix of giddy excitement and cautious restraint. He introduced me to his favorite park trails, where we walked hand in hand beneath canopies of golden leaves. I showed him my secret hideaways, a quiet bookstore tucked away on a side street, a rooftop cafe with panoramic views of the city skyline. Each shared experience deepened the bond between us, making it harder to imagine life without him. But reality has a way of intruding when you least expect. IT started subtly. A sideways glance from a coworker as I mentioned grabbing coffee during lunch, a neighbor's raised eyebrow when they saw his patrol car parked outside my apartment one evening. At first, I dismissed these moments as paranoia, remnants of years spent hiding parts of myself from prying eyes. But soon, the whispers became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while waiting in line at the grocery store, I overheard two women discussing that cop who got too friendly with a civilian. Their voices carried just enough disdain to make my stomach churn. I didn't need to hear their names to know they were talking about us. The details were vague, speculative, but the implications stung all the same. Someone had noticed. Someone always did. When I told him about it later that night, his expression hardened, though he tried to mask it with reassurance. "Let them talk," he said firmly, pulling me into his arms. "Their opinions don't define us." "I know," I replied, leaning into his embrace. "But what if it's not just talk? What if it affects your job, your reputation?" He hesitated, the weight of my question settling between us. "I won't lie, it's a risk. But I chose this path knowing there'd be challenges. If I have to choose between living authentically or playing it safe, I'll take authenticity every time." His words should have comforted me, but instead, they only amplified my guilt. Here he was, willing to risk everything for something real, while I still clung to fragments of fear and doubt. Was I strong enough to stand beside him, or would I crumble under the pressure? The tension escalated further when my sister called unexpectedly. She hadn't reached out in months, not since our last awkward conversation about why I never brought anyone home for holidays, and her timing couldn't have been worse. I answered reluctantly, bracing myself for another round of thinly veiled judgment. "So, Mom mentioned seeing a police car near your place recently," she began, her tone deceptively casual. "Everything okay?" My throat tightened. Of course, she'd find a way to bring it up. "Yeah, fine," I lied, forcing a laugh. "Just a neighbor." Her skepticism was palpable even through the phone. "Funny, because Mom said she saw you getting into the car. Looked pretty cozy from what she described. Damn small towns and their nosy residents." I gripped the edge of the counter, searching for a response that wouldn't spiral into disaster. "It's nothing serious," I said finally, hating how hollow the word sounded. "Just hanging out." There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice softer now. "You know you can tell me anything. right? Whatever's going on, I'm here for you." Her sincerity caught me off guard, unraveling some of the defenses I'd built around myself. For a brief moment, I considered telling her the truth, not just about him, but about everything I'd kept hidden for so long. But the fear of rejection, of losing even the fragile connection we had, held me back. "Thanks," I muttered instead, evading her unspoken question. "I'll let you know if anything changes." After we hung up, I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. How could something so beautiful feel so suffocating? Every step forward seemed to come with a price, every moment of joy shadowed by the threat of loss. And yet, despite it all, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Things came to a head one Friday evening when we decided to grab dinner at a local restaurant. It was supposed to be a low-key date, nothing fancy, just burgers and fries in a dimly lit corner booth. But halfway through the meal, a group of officers from his precinct walked in, their laughter loud enough to draw attention. His body stiffened immediately, his fork clattering against the plate as he debated whether to acknowledge them. "What do you want to do?" I asked quietly, my pulse racing. "We don't have to stay." "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "I'm tired of hiding. Let them see." Before I could protest, one of the officers spotted us and approached the table, his grin faltering slightly as he took in the scene. Well, look who's slumming it tonight," he teased, though the edge in his voice betrayed his discomfort. "Didn't peg you for the romantic type, Carter." "This is Alex," he replied evenly, gesturing toward me. "And yeah, maybe I'm romantic. Got a problem with that." The officer held up his hands in mock surrender, chuckling nervously. "Hey, no judgment here. Just surprised, that's all." With a final nod, he returned to his friends, leaving behind a trail of murmured comments and furtive glances. For the rest of the meal, neither of us spoke much, the weight of the encounter hanging heavily between us. When we left the restaurant, the air felt colder than before, the streets emptier. As we drove back to my apartment in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. That night, lying awake beside him, I replayed the evening's events over and over in my mind. The stares, the whispers, the subtle shift in his demeanor. It all pointed to a future fraught with uncertainty. Could we survive this? Did we even deserve to try? As if sensing my turmoil, he rolled over and pulled me close, his breath warm against my neck. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm brewing outside. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." I wanted to believe him. More than anything, I wanted to trust that love could conquer fear, that vulnerability wasn't weakness. But as I drifted off to sleep, wrapped in his arms, I couldn't shake the lingering question. How much were we willing to sacrifice for each other? And at what point would the cost become too great? The weeks that followed were a test of endurance, resilience, and faith, not just in each other, but in ourselves. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. Yet with every challenge we faced, something remarkable happened. We became stronger. Not because the world suddenly accepted us, but because we learned to accept ourselves. Together point one evening. After another long day of navigating sideways glances and loaded silences, he showed up at my door unannounced. His expression was unreadable, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his leather jacket. For a moment, I thought the worst, that he'd come to say goodbye, to admit that the weight of it all had finally broken him. But then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and pulled me into his arms without a word. "I'm not running," he said firmly, as though reading my mind. "Not from this. Not from you." Relief washed over me, so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. "I don't want you to," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But sometimes I wonder, is it worth it? All this pain, all this judgment." He cupped my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. "Love isn't supposed to be easy. If it were, it wouldn't mean as much. What we have, it's real. And yeah, it's messy and hard and scary as hell. But it's also beautiful. Don't you feel that?" I did. Every time he held me, every time he kissed me, every time he looked at me like I was the only person in the room, I felt it. A love so profound it made the rest of the world fade away, even if only for a moment. Still, the fear lingered, whispering doubts I couldn't silence. What if it's not enough? I asked softly, voicing the question that had haunted me since the beginning. What if no matter how much we fight for this, the world keeps pushing back? Then we push harder, he replied, his voice unwavering. We build our own world, one where we don't have to hide or apologize for who we are. It won't be perfect, but it'll be ours. His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with a truth I'd been too afraid to embrace. Love wasn't about finding someone who made life easier. It was about finding someone who made life worth living, even when it was difficult. And he did. He made every struggle, every sacrifice feel worthwhile that a few days later, I decided to confront one of my biggest fears, telling my family. I invited my sister over for coffee, knowing she'd bring her sharp intuition and endless questions. When she arrived, I could tell she sensed something was different. My nervous energy gave me away almost immediately. "You're hiding something," she said bluntly, stirring sugar into her mug. "Spill it." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment I've been dreading and preparing for all at once. Taking a deep breath, I met her gaze and spoke the words I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head. "There's someone in my life." I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Someone important, and it's complicated." Her brow furrowed, curiosity overtaking skepticism. "Complicated how?" "He's a cop," I admitted, bracing myself for her reaction. "And he's a man." For a moment, she simply stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Well, it's about damn time." I blinked, stunned. "What?" "Oh, come on," she said, rolling her eyes playfully. "Did you really think I hadn't figured it out years ago? You've been dancing around this your whole life. Honestly, I'm just glad you finally found someone who makes you happy." Tears welled in my eyes, relief crashing over me like a wave. "You're not mad, Mel." She laughed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Why would I be mad? You're my brother. Your happiness matters to me. Always has." Her acceptance was a gift I hadn't realized I needed, a reminder that love, in all its forms, deserved celebration, not shame. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I didn't have to hide, where I could introduce him to the people who mattered most without fear of rejection. As the months passed, we continued to navigate the challenges of our relationship, learning to lean on each other in ways neither of us had thought possible. There were still moments of doubt, nights when the weight of the world felt unbearable. But through it all, we held on to the belief that love was worth fighting for. One crisp autumn morning, we returned to the park where we'd shared our first kiss. The trees were ablaze with color, their leaves swirling in the breeze like confetti. As we walked along the familiar path, hand in hand, he stopped suddenly and turned to face me. "I never thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere, "for trusting me, for letting me in." I smiled, shaking my head. "You don't need to thank me. You saved me, remember?" He chuckled, pulling me into his arms. "Guess that makes us even then." We stood there for a while, wrapped in each other's embrace, watching the sun rise over the horizon. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the changing season, I realized something profound. Love wasn't about erasing fear or eliminating obstacles. It was about choosing to move forward despite them, holding tight to the person who made the journey meaningful. And as I looked into his eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch and the steadiness of his presence, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, we'd face it together.